We now have Cindy Cook from Equine Nutrition from Cargill Animal Nutrition joining us. I'm going to put the table right over to you, Cindy, just so that we don't have, we're not going over our time. And Cindy's going to talk about feeding the hindgut or feeding the horse in general. Take it away, Cindy.
So thanks for coming, everybody, tonight. And my apologies to Robert because we were trying to switch computers because my computer wasn't cooperating. So we had a whole thing. So that was a good presentation considering we were all up here doing gymnastics. Anyway, thank you for Deb and Maggie and the rest of the Sharpe team for having me. I used to work with these lovely ladies quite a few years ago, and they switched my territory. So I'm the fill-in chick today. The other person couldn't be here, so hopefully we can answer some of your questions. So Deb asked me to speak today briefly on feeding for the healthy digestive system. You guys are lucky here at Sharpe's. There's lots of people here that work very hard to supply you guys with all that information. So we're going to try to just top that up a bit. So if you have any further questions, they can come out to your farm and answer them for you as well. The one pitch I always try to make, I've worked with Purina between dealership levels and then at head office for almost 20 years. One thing we're pretty proud about, all our feed is made in 100% medication-free plants. Not too many people can say that, and we made that decision because we want your horse to be safe. Obviously, in the performance world, it's a big issue for testing and things of that nature. And if you need any further information, the ladies at Sharpe's can certainly supply that. And we have our new website as well, which is pretty good. So I start a little bit, even though I sell feed for a living, the biggest mistake I see 100% of the time on farm is water. I have somebody phone me and ask me how many milligrams of selenium. They're all worried about selenium. I go to their farm and there isn't a bucket of water. And I'm thinking, that's maybe not so important right now. So horses can only live 5 or 6 days without water. And it just amazes me when people are building barns. That's not the first thing they're looking at when they're trying to coordinate where they're spending their money. I know a heated tack room is nice for us as humans, but maybe some money for water lines and hydro outside is a good thing. So as horses age, body water content drops, and therefore they're more susceptible to dehydration and impaction colic. And the horse's body composition is approximately 65 to 75% water. And as Alex was saying way at the beginning when she was describing the digestive system, hindgut holds 30% of the body's water. It's just really important, really important. So even before I sell you feed, the first thing I'm looking at is what is your water habits on your farm. Okay. So water has many roles. The big one I'm here to talk to you about tonight is digestion. Alex too touched on saliva production, temperature regulation, and the metabolism. So it's pretty important. Water loss occurs in feces and urine, respiration and sweating. And we also know water intake is affected by a lot of things. Certainly their temperature, water pH. We had that actually happen. I had a horse customer with a swine farm, and they were fiddling with the pH for some swine infections, and it actually affected the horses. And understanding salt and the role of salt in the horse's diet for water. So when I'm starting on farm, I talk first about water before I look at any decisions about what I'm going to feed your horse and what we're going to put into it. And then my next step before I've even sold you bag of feed is to talk about your hay. So I've done a little hay thing, depending on how much time Deb says I have here. I'll leave some of the slides and you guys can look through it, but I'll try to kind of give you an idea where I'm going. So forage is the primary part of your horse's diet. And when I go on farm and I have some people talk to me, oh, you know, oats are natural to horses. What is natural to horses is pasture. So even hay, as human beings, we make hay because we live in North America, and that's the way we can give safe forage to horses through the winter time, because we have winter here. But pasture is natural to your horse. And guess what? It's 80–85% water. So it's no surprise that that's why it's important. And there are many different types of hays, and quality matters. And this is where I sort of get into it a little bit with people in barn. You pick up hay and you shake it and you tell me it's just a little dusty. That's mold. It's not just a little moldy, it's mold, right? Dust is mold. So you should be picking your grain the feed that you work out with the ladies here at Sharpe's, and the supplement portion of your diet based on your forage program. Right, so I've come into your farm, I've talked to you about your water. What are your water habits? Do you have water outside so this horse can drink in the wintertime? You can't. So all those things come into play before I pick a feed, and then the type of hay you're feeding. How much are you feeding? Do they get free choice hay? Do they get hay a few times a day? And what does that look like? So again, I'm sort of pounding on the hydration thing, but to me, I can set up the best feed program in the world. If your horse doesn't have decent forage and good hydration, it won't do what it needs to do. So fiber is a good thing, but like everything in our life, we have pros and cons. We have features and benefits. Obviously, some of the performance problems are an issue for, you look at people with performance horses. They're concerned about hay intake in the racing world. They're worried about emptying on the track, things of that nature. One thing about hays and a lot of the fibers, dust and mold, that can cause diseases and things that you end up having your veterinarian in for. But the main bonuses, I think, certainly outweigh a lot of the problems. So hindgut health, ulcer prevention, it's your best source of calcium and phosphorus, which is very important, and prevention of colic, and sometimes in behavioral issues. So when we come into your farm and we do a hay test, now not everybody can control the hay. So this is the other challenge we have. If you're boarding at a place that may have multiple hay suppliers, you may have to use what they offer to you, but this is what I look at when I'm looking at hay tests. So the first thing I look at is dry matter. So dry matter on your forage test is a good indicator of when I need to test for molds. So in my happy world, I like to see a dry matter of about 85 and above. Anything below that, I'll probably suggest you do a mold test. Then I'm looking about how digestible or how good is the hay. So you can't tell how good a hay is by looking at it. I don't care if it's green or brown or whatever. You can't tell how good it is unless you actually do that chemistry. Okay, so your ADF includes cellulose, lignin, and insoluble starches, which are indigestible. All right, and fragments of the cell wall. So the higher the ADF, the less digestible it is. Your NDF is your neutral detergent fiber, which is your total cell wall. Your hemulose, your cellulose, and there's lignin, and it affects dry matter intake and energy intake. So for us guys in the horse world, what that means to you, for everybody who has maybe horses like me that kind of hang around the pasture a lot, and they're not curvy, they're fat. This is important. How digestible is the hay? Maybe you want to look at a hay that is not quite as caloric as some of the other hays out there. We get into other challenges though. We've done a very good job in Ontario finding grassy, non-high calorie hay for our fat horses, but then we've run into other problems because they tend to have the highest sugar counts. So for all those horses that have insulin resistance, metabolic issues, not so good, right? So again, there's always pros and cons. So the next thing I sort of look at is the lignin and the indigestible portion of the cell wall, and why this is important is the coarser that hay is, the harder it is for that horse to process. Right? It's not going to get through that digestive system as effectively as it should. And then I look at digestible energy, which is measured in megacalories per kilogram. So those are some of the base things. We can get pretty technical and get into all sorts of different things, but those are some of the base things I look at. I've also listed here how we measure mold. It's measured in CFUs, which is colony forming units. And we have all sorts of lists from AMAFRA and various organizations. What is deemed safe and what is not deemed safe. Certainly if you have a breeding type of operation, that's very critical. But I would say a lot of even the specialists, some are more flexible than others. And the biggest thing I think we have now that we've really got to, instead of looking at non-fiber carbohydrates or NSCs, we are looking at WSC and ESCs, which is actually taking the starches and the carbohydrates. So that's something the horse is going to be digesting, and breaking it down into numbers where we're starting to see where it affects horses that are laminitic and have issues with metabolic system. Okay, so that's a whole bunch of stuff, and we're looking at this piece of hay we're feeding the horse, and we're thinking, okay, how much of this can we control and how much can't we control? The good news is excuse me, if we have this information, we can balance the ration better. If I know what's in your hay, I can balance, I can choose the right feed, I can choose the right supplement, and it will do a better job. So here's just an example of a quality report. This was a hay taken off my farm a few years ago, and it sort of gives you what the variances are, right? And so any of the ladies here at Sharpe's can do that for you. Then I get into what else does the horse need as far as digestion goes and keeping that animal alive, and where is that coming from? So when I look at starches, starches provide calories. It's important where it's digested. So actually, Alex talked a little bit about that today, where everything is digested in the horse's digestive system. Amount of starch fed and when it is fed affects digestion, and source and processing should be considered. So this is a big discussion I have with people on farm. There's people, I don't like pellets, I love pellets. I don't like oats, I love oats. What people need to know, though, is processing does affect digestibility, right? And if that horse isn't chewing that whole properly, that whole piece of corn properly, it does affect the rest of the digestive system. So you need to understand that. So it can be efficient and can affect performance, you know, for the good, and it is digested in the foregut. So a lot of the feeds and where the research has gone and where we're moving is actually using the hindgut more effectively, because that's where the fiber's also digested. So it's your most digestible source of energy, and it provides really good calorie. And we know all these people now who are investing in purchasing animals that are maybe previously performance horses, thoroughbreds, and maybe standardbreds, a little more on the high-strung side, they're looking for a feed that doesn't make them hot. Okay, it's known as the calming feed. You feed less, actually. It's more caloric than a lot of starches. So it can be an efficient way of putting weight on a horse. And what they're finding is it's becoming ideal for horses that need long burning fuel, right? So very, very, endurance people knew this a long time ago, but we're seeing the race people move in that direction. So talking just real quickly about vitamins and minerals and where your horse gets them from. So when we're looking at hay tests, 0, just about, for water-soluble vitamins. By the time I bale that, put it in the mouth, go in, pull core samples, take it to the lab, have it tested. Water-soluble vitamins, or about 0. Okay? Complete feeds, and where I'm going with this, only complete if you feed to tag, right? So why I'm saying that there is if you're assuming your horse is getting all its nutrients from its hay, it's not. So if you buy a bag of grain, whatever that may be, and you're looking at the tag and you're not feeding it even closely to what is recommended for your horse, that means you're going to be missing some vitamins. So to balance your horse's diet, you must account for vitamins and minerals at an appropriate level from the appropriate source, which is something that seems to be challenging for people to figure out. So I'm not going to focus on this too much because it doesn't have stuff to do with digestion, but what I'm trying to point out is some of these vitamins are stored in the body and some aren't. Right? So your fat-soluble vitamins are stored in the body and can be more likely to build up for toxic levels. So I've listed some deficiencies, I've listed some toxicities, but the one thing you have to know is sometimes the horse manufactures it itself and sometimes it doesn't. So vitamin A, for instance, is not produced within the horse and must come from the diet. So that's why you see some of the feeds, especially designed for breeding animals and yearling and growing animals, you know, very specifically doing research in that area. So vitamin A is stored in the liver up to 6 months. Guess what? Best source is green pasture. Fiber, like green pasture. Okay. So vitamin D actually assists in intestinal absorption of calcium and phosphorus and is our sunshine vitamin. But guess what? How many people here have show horses? And I drive by fields now, and they got the mask on, and then they got the fly sheet, UVB, so their coat doesn't fade, and they're like wrapped in bubble wrap, and they're out there. But there's not a lot of sun absorption going on, right? So they got to get it from somewhere. So one of the deficiencies is calcification of bones, stunted growth, and in severe cases, rickets, which I personally never seen in the years I've worked in this industry, but it does happen. And then there is a toxicity, right? Because it is a fat soluble vitamin. So vitamin E, again, is not produced within the horse's body and comes from good quality pasture. The other thing I've listed here, it also comes from good alfalfa hay. So in the horse industry, I come from a cattle background. We're not so afraid of alfalfa, but there was a huge shift when I first started working in the industry, and everybody got away from alfalfa hays. We were worried about it. It's this, it's that, it's this, and that, but it's actually a very good source of a lot of nutrients. It's a very good source of calorie. And in actuality, a lot of these alfalfa hays, the challenge are they're very high in calories, but they tend to be lower in sugars. So all those metabolic horses, and you know how we were always worried, laminated horses, get them off the rich hay. Well, you might want them off the alfalfa hay for other reasons, but it actually tends to have lower sugar levels than those very, very mature grassy hays. So vitamin E, though, the amount decreases post-baling after time. That's something to know. So if you have hay in your mouth that's a few years old, it's going to deplete over time. So one of the deficiency is muscle wastage, and toxicity levels interfere with absorption of other fat-soluble vitamins. So I'm throwing that out there because Maggie and Debbie will laugh, but my boss usually comes to these seminars and has a huge chemical interaction chart, and it's this huge graph that you look at it and your mind just spins. But it's just unbelievable how the dominoes fall when you start monkeying around with stuff. And I go into a lot of barns and there's a lot of top dressing. So if you know what your horse is drinking, you know what's in your hay, and you're following the recommendations of the feeding program using a complete feed and maybe a ration balancer, you really need to ask yourself why you're top dressing extra vitamins and minerals. And if you are, you should be working with your vet, you should be working with your dealer rep nutritionist to make sure you're not overfeeding some or maybe underfeeding others. So again, we look at vitamin K. It's present in good hay. You see where I'm going with this? Water, hay, water, hay. Even though I self-feed for a living here. But it's really, really important. And guess what? Manufactured by the large intestine. So we're seeing here, we have vitamins that the horse can manufacture itself. We're also seeing ones that they can't and where they have to come from. So actually, Robert talked a little bit about the importance of B vitamins, and I couldn't agree with him more, right? Water-soluble vitamins are produced by beneficial microbial organisms in the cecum and large intestine. But guess what? One of your best sources, again, good quality pasture. And what does good quality pasture have? Water. Okay? So the challenge, though, with this is now we live in the real world. And one of the things we're seeing, and I'm seeing being out there for as many years and as old as I am, I'm seeing a lot of horses. When I was a kid growing up, an old horse was 12, 13 years old. We're seeing horses 28, 29, 30, like riding and still doing things and all that kind of stuff. The horse becomes less efficient when it's sick, when it's very young and maybe the cecum is still developing, when it's very old, maybe things are slowing down a little bit, or there's something else going on in its environment that it's stressed. So the first thing that happens when a horse is stressed or not feeling well, they urinate and they pass the urine, right? So sometimes it's hugely beneficial to replace your vitamin D at what they call a prophylactic level to give the horse the efficiency it needs in the hindgut to do what it needs to do. So deficiency is not well documented. If you look through the National Research Council books and that, they don't really have anything that's specific. We do know these are some of the signs: poor appetite, poor coordination. I've never seen it. And because B vitamins are water soluble, it's less likely to happen than those that are fat soluble, that are stored in the body. Okay, so this is one of the big ones, vitamin C. So it's synthesized from glucose in the horse's liver and thought not to be a dietary requirement. But I just spoke a couple minutes ago about how old our horses are. My favorite horse in the world, he lived to be 32 years old, which was like, and he's big horse, big draft horse. Horses are living longer. So how good is their body when they're 32 years old, which is, I don't know, 1 million years old, human age. I'm not sure how old that is in human age, in doing what they need to do as they age, right? So this is the other challenge I'm throwing out to you people. Not that I think you should change your programs all the time, but as your horse goes through his life, you shouldn't be feeding a baby horse the same as you feed a senior. And if you want to get the best bang for your buck nutritionally, you choose the hay and the hydration practices and your riding practices for good health and mobility, and the best feed for that stage of his life. And that's sort of a big pet peeve of mine. Like I go into barns and they're like, well, yeah, but I feed juvenile to everybody else because I don't have this one senior horse. Well, there's a big difference the way they process things. So it's being brought to the attention in senior diets because we're seeing now, because they're living older, that maybe they're not doing quite such a good job. So you're seeing in a lot of the senior feeds, VitaminE like that. So I didn't even get into the whole mineral thing because that would be another 4 hours. So I just, that can be another one for Deb and Maggie another day. But what I wanted people to understand here is when I go into a barn and I'm ration balancing, there seems to be a confusion about how things are measured. Okay, so macro minerals are measured in grams, and micros are measured in milligrams, parts per million, IUs per kg, and I've listed them all there. So there is a difference when you're picking your supplements with your nutrition rep on farm. Do you need a ration balancer? Do you have that fat horse like me that really does not need any kind of grain, does not need calorie, can live on hay and sustain his body condition? But I'm probably going to pick a ration balancer to make sure his calcium and phosphorus and sodium and chlorine and sulfur are all where they need to be, as well as his micronutrients. Now, if I have a show horse where I'm feeding him 3 or 4 kilos a day of Trimax, and I just want to top up his performance minerals, I probably don't need a macronutrient. I probably need a micro. So there is a difference, and inclusions rate counts. So when I go against competition, and you have to talk apples to apples, right? Because all the supplements have different inclusion rates. So again, I go back to consider these questions. I go on the farm and I talk about hydration practices. I talk about forage on farm. I talk about the medical issues, workload, so I can figure out how many calories this horse needs to sustain. And then here comes the thing. So I have the owner of the farm, the barn manager, the guy that owns the horse. We may have a veterinarian involved. I find the farriers like to put their 2 cents worth in. And then I got the owner of the horse. And then I got the horse's needs. And people wonder why I dye my hair. It's just, you just don't have to do that on a dairy farm. You just don't have to do that on a dairy farm. But where I'm going with this is it's supposed to be a team effort, right? So not every feed's going to fit everybody's protocols and what they need and stuff like that. But be honest with your equine rep that comes on farm and what you're doing. And I think also be accountable. If I go in there and I'm seeing a horse that has issues and I'm following Alex's description here where, hey, you need to cut your feed back and feed 3 feedings a day instead of 2 feedings a day. But you really can only feed 1 feeding a day because you work, 2 hours away from your farm or where your horse is bordered or wherever for the day, and it's just not possible. You have to tell the nutrition person that so they can figure out what's the best feed. We have feeds that have 2.9 megacalories per kilogram, and then we have feeds all the way up to 3.5 megacalories per kilogram. And then the different processing affects digestibility. So applying benefits of what type of processing and how the horse digests it is very important. And again, if you're feeding off tag, your vitamin and minerals are not balanced. Okay, so these people with easy keeping horses, you don't need extra calories, you need a ration balancer. If you have a horse in the middle, I have a quarter horse at my place now, that he doesn't need the 4 kilos a day that my bag of Lulu is recommending, because he's got quarter horse in him, but he needs 2 kilos. So I'm balancing his vitamin and minerals from there. One of the things that I think people miss a lot is when they're looking at stuff, and this is one of the things I challenge you today out in nutrition, feeding a horse is actually pretty cheap. I know people think that's a little weird I said that. I can feed a horse pretty good not, let's say taking away the hay, but the grain portion of the diet for well under $100 a month, even a higher performance horse. You start adding supplements and doodads and things, yes, it adds up. I can't feed my dog for $100. And we got an over 1,000-pound animal. So I think people have to get real a little bit about what the costs are, and also if you're boarding at somebody's place and just sort of the magnitude of all these different species doing all these different things. And the one case I wanted to bring up with you just today, I had a farm I was bidding on, this was several years ago. They were with a competitor. They did a great job. I couldn't get in the door. They did a really great job. But one day they were having some issues, and I went in, and they, oh, we'll do this, we want to do this, we want to do this. And I said, well, the only thing you're going to do in this barn right now are 40 horses, all different breeds, show people, pleasure people, great variety, right? They had different hays going through the barn different times a year. For 1 month, I want you to wet your feet. So they, well, we're not feeding all fiber feeds. I said, yeah, I like to wet my fiber feeds, but I want you to wet all the feed. So anyway, the lady said, well, I'm not going to do it. I got 40 horses that I feed twice a day. I'm not going to do it. And I said, I'll tell you what, I'll give you $200 if you do it. Just humor me and do it. And I said, I'm not even going to take your feed business. Don't even change anything. I'll give you $200 cash. So I did. And anyway, she did. So I came back in a month and I said, okay, what did you see? She says, everybody in this barn gained weight. Everybody. They were all on different feeds, some on different hay door runs, all on different work schedules. Everybody gained weight. Why? They were hydrated. Because the first thing I noticed in that barn, it was a beautiful barn, but built way, way back in the 50s. There was no water outside for the horses. And there was no way I was going to go into that barn and try to bid on that account, and they were going to run into the same quality. Right? So my point to them being is this was a management issue, wasn't even a feed issue. I couldn't, the competition had done a good job. They put a good feed in. But she was willing at that point to negotiate. If this was their price to poker. So the one thing they did, they didn't want to wet feed forever. They spent some money and they put some water out in the pallets. And I was very lucky I got their business and they're still with me today. But it was a process of them understanding some of these management issues. So I'll just talk real briefly, just about textures and things like that. Extruded, I don't know if everybody here knows what extrusion is, but everybody knows what grains are, sweet feeds. If we cook a sweet feed, your corn or your barley, and we put it through a mechanical dye, that's a pellet. If we put that through a mechanical dye and we cook it under pressure, that's what they call extrusion. So the one thing we know that there's benefits is extrusion. We know it can be helpful if you're concerned about allergies. Now there's a whole other realm for the allergy thing, and that would be a discussion for Dr. Crawford to come up and tackle. I don't even want to go near with the 10-foot pole. We do know it's helpful in horses that seem to have some sensitivities to some of the grains, because when you extrude something, you're cooking it under pressure and you're changing the protein on a molecular level. So the theory is they don't get a histamine response. And so far we've had some good results. But that's what extrusion is, so that we know that you know and have an understanding of how we make feed. So I already talked about pelleting. The one thing about pellets, some people are like anti-pellets and all horses choke on pellets. Horses don't choke on pellets if they're fed right. And a pellet's not a pellet. You can have a pellet that's 100% fiber, which they might choke on if they're not hydrated. But you can have a pellet that's 100% grain, and they're not likely to choke on unless they're a real gorger. Okay, so pelleting can be a good thing. It's easier to digest. And actually, Dr. Crawford's discussion about group feeding wormer. If you're group feeding, I wouldn't want to feed a sweet feed because they can segregate. You got that boss, and I'm going to be there, out there, taking what she wants and leaving the rest for everybody else behind. Right? So that's where pelleting for people that are feeding in a group situation is a beneficial thing. So I just put up there what they look like. I think everybody's seen these. So we got extrusions, we got sweet feeds. I want people to understand a little something about sweet feeds. You can have an expensive sweet feed, you can have an inexpensive sweet feed, but they're not all the same. Okay, if you come and tell me you're feeding a 14%, that doesn't tell me anything. That doesn't tell me how many calories, it doesn't tell me the vitamin mineral profile, it doesn't tell me how digestible that is the corn cracked, is it flaked? You know, there's lots of different sweet feeds. So make sure that you have an understanding of the ingredients. Multi-particle, this is probably our fastest growing line. which we think gives a lot of people the benefit of both worlds. Okay, so people that like low NSC feeds, okay, so that's feeds that are low glycemic, you know, but one challenge is they're mostly fiber, so they got to be hydrated, or you got to feed them wet. They often will go to the multi-particle because they're in the low glycemic scale. So you're not going all the way up to a sweet feed, which is like a 35 on your NSC. So you're hovering around that 18 to 20 NSC, which for a lot of horses that you have concerns about sugar intake, it is a good thing. And the one nice thing about that is it does have the benefits of adding sometimes some pre and probiotics. Now, that being said, I'm going to be honest with you, nobody ever feeds enough of it, right, to often get the benefits of the pre and probiotics. So that's when you talk to your supplement person and you look at using that for, especially for performance horses. So I already kind of went through there. The sweet feed thing, you know, I have a lot of customers that use a lot of our sweet feeds, and for some people they feel it's in its natural state. It can be less expensive than some of the processed feeds, but our most expensive high-end sweet feed is just as expensive as our high-end multi-particle feed. It's all the bells and whistles that go in, right? So I can have a sweet feed that has 3 megacals. I can have a sweet feed that has 3.5 megacals. That affects the horse differently and how much you can feed them, right? So when Alex was talking a little bit earlier on about, you know, limiting, you only feed so much per feeding based on the horse's size. I'll tend to use a higher end calorie feed, for a high performance horse that needs it, but I'll sometimes use it in barn situations where they're saying, you know what, I can't feed 3 or 4 times a day. So I need something that I can feed a small amount and get a denser form of calories. So there are other uses for it.
Can I just interrupt there for a second? Just go back so my train of thought stays where it's supposed to be. You talk about a natural state.
Yes.
And how people want to feed as close to a natural state. Can you expand on that and how a natural state in our management programs isn't always beneficial for horses?
Yeah, so this is kind of a tricky conversation for me because I'm a farmer. So I'm not much of a tree hugger. And I can get into a whole thing about the whole GMO stuff and all that, and that's a whole other conversation. Natural state, to me, what's natural to the horse's pasture. Okay, and I said that when I started this conversation. I self-feed for a living, but forage is the most natural thing to horses. So, yes, we fed oats and things for years and years and years, but wild horses aren't running around oat fields. They're running around brush and, you know, grasses that, you know, sometimes are palatable, sometimes aren't palatable. There's intake issues. The one thing when you talk about oats, and not that oats are bad, we use oats in lots of our feeds, but it's their application, right? So if you have a horse that's not chewing very well, and this is why a lot of our senior products, you know, the multi-particle one in particular, is processed because we know that horses don't chew as well as they get older. Even if people are maintaining their teeth and looking after them, we don't want that starch getting to the hindgut. So I think people need to be careful about what is considered natural. And I think for everybody, it means something different, right? To me, it's not natural sticking a horse out and not having water out in front of it. I know I keep harping on that. But I mean, what's natural to one person is different than another, right? But anyway, that's my opinion. I'm sorry to all the tree huggers out there. So I go into a little bit of information about our feed, so I'll wrap it up because I know the next speaker needs to come up. But some of the features and the benefits, one of the big things in the research now that we're very solid on is the use of high fat and fiber products. I think people need to understand when you're dropping that NSC and you're getting down 12, 11, our integrity is 10, which is safe to use in laminated horses, but you're getting a fiber that is so dense, right? That's the only way we can get that sugar level down. You have to wet it because they need hydration, right? We're trying to replicate pasture here. All feeds have features and benefits, and I think the biggest challenge I've been into miniature farms, and they'll say, oh, well, I'm feeding Trimax. Wow, okay, great. You know, hope that horse is pulling that little chuck wagon good. But I mean, I think a lot of times the fault is not the feed's fault. It's because we as people pick the wrong feed because we don't look at the mission statement on the tag. We don't talk to the feed store rep that's been through 87 years of education and on-farm practices here. We don't speak to our vets and give them all the information. And so we sometimes don't make the right decision. And there's a lot of filing around out there on the internet. And you know what? There's tons of good stuff out there. But farm application is different, right? So use the people in your team to work together. And if you're boarding at a stable, you have to include the person that's running the boarding stable. They may have 30 or 40 other horses to manage. And they get, whoa, you know, you're coming in and you're changing everything. You have to make it as easy as possible for everybody. So I already did the multi-particle example. I'll just move on quickly. The benefits of omega-3. A lot of the Purina feeds, we have flax in our feed. You know, there's actually quite good research on younger horses for brain development with omega-6 and 3. We know that flax is a good thing. And so, sorry, I'm standing in front of your slide there. So we have it in a lot of the feeds. But here's the thing. If we're not feeding to tag, how beneficial is it? So again, if you're feeding a handful of a feed that's telling you to feed 2 kilos a day, but you can't feed 2 kilos a day because your horse is getting fat, then maybe that's not the right feed. So people have to understand that whole process. So I talked about pellets already before, that you can have a starch-based pellet and a fiber-based pellet. So on Purina's website and probably most of our competitors, ingredient lists are on there so people can look at that and understand the difference. So a pellet is not a pellet, right? Depending on the ingredient in it, they can be different. I already talked a lot tonight about the ranges in calories. I think a lot of people don't understand that concept. So again, if you're not sure, just ask. You guys have great reps here at Sharpe. We have an online Purina Connect service. There's lots of information out there. And probably one of my biggest pet peeves is protein levels don't necessarily go hand in hand with high or low calories. So just because you're feeding a 14%, it doesn't mean it's a high calorie feed. And where I throw that back to, and actually Alex brought this up at the beginning, horses are monogastric. So if I segue a little bit to human health, what do doctors put you on if they want you to lose weight? A high protein diet. So protein in and of itself is actually not the greatest form of calorie, right? So there's a bit of a misunderstanding about that. And I see it a lot on farm that, oh, I can't feed that because it's too high in protein. They'll put on too much weight. That's actually one of those phantom mystery myths out there. I go in a little bit, and if anybody ever wants a tour, we do arrange tours. Do you guys do tours here at Sharpe's a little bit with mills and things like that? It is an interesting process if you ever want to have an understanding of rolling and cracking and steam plating and what the difference are about digestibility and where it's digested in the horse's gut system. So that understanding is crucial to understand why your feed is as many calories as it is.
How often do you hold the tours? Yeah.
We usually try to stay away from the summertime, but if you have a group of 10 or more, usually can be arranged within a couple of weeks. Okay. So energy to me as a nutrition person on the road means calories, but when I go on farm, I try to clarify, because a lot of times when people tell me the horse has too much energy, they're not telling me he's too fat. They're telling me he's got mental energy. And one of my biggest challenges here is I have a lot of customers who adopt ex-race horses for secondary homing and trying to turn them into pleasure horses. I can't turn a thoroughbred into a port horse. All right. So even the nicest thoroughbred in the world, I can do a lot of things nutritionally to not exacerbate that problem by making him hot. But by starving him and not feeding him, calm him down, in that theory, well, I'm cutting back his brain, he's getting too hot. Not a good idea. All right, you should be calling a rep to come on farm, figure out what is the right feed that's less likely going to make that problem worse, but you have to feed him to his nutritional requirements. And something you guys should all know, these thoroughbreds coming off the racetrack will always need 15% more as a maintenance requirement, even though he's not running, he might just be a pasture animal now, than my horse that's never done anything in his life. Okay, because you've changed him metabolically. I use the Donovan Bailey example. I saw him on TV the other night, actually doing a sportscast. He was an Olympic runner. I bet you eats 40 times more than I eat and never gains an athlete. Metabolically, he's different. He was an athlete, right? So his requirements for nutrition and for maintenance requirements are a lot different than myself. So I go a little bit here into ration balancing, and this is something that Deb and Maggie can help you with. If you are not feeding to what your tag on your feed tag recommends, are you buying the right feed? If you deem that you are, should you be using a ration balancer and what kind? Okay, so we're getting into hays now. I got 40 acres of hay down in my farm. Deb's got her hay down in her farm. I pick what supplement I'm going to use based on my hay analysis. Okay, so you pick the right product. That's how you save money and you get the right nutrition. So I talked a little bit about protein. These are kind of my last couple slides for practical information. Percentages don't mean a whole lot. When you're figuring it out, it's total grams per day. And there's lots of ways to get there. And for everybody who's worried about the protein thing and the horse's digestive system, grass, roughly 22% protein. Most horses, unless they have some sort of metabolic issue or laminitic issue, do just fine. But again, 85% water. Keep coming back to this water and how it affects the digestive system, especially with fiber. All right, so hays can be 7% crude protein all the way up to 20% crude protein, and it's usually less than 15% water. So think about how that affects the digestive system when it goes through. It has to be digested, right? Because we condition these horses in North America to sustain themselves, at least in the wintertime, on hay. So geographically speaking, since I've been doing this job, when I was first seeing grass hays out there in Ontario, ranges were 9 to 11%, so we're talking 25 years ago. The average hays we've been seeing in the last 5 years of the grass hays have been 5, 6, 7, a high one, 9, because our weather patterns are changing, right? So people have to cut hay when they can dry it. So what I'm seeing is later cut hay. You know, my hay's down now, but I have some of my customers that haven't cut their first cut hay. You cut that in July, you have a very mature plant. You're going to have really high sugar levels, really low calorie, because your lignin value increases substantially because you cut late. But sometimes you have to cut late because it's better to have a dry hay than a moldy hay, right? So there's lots of practical things to think about. Again, with the hydration, I keep pounding that, and the ration balancing. But actually, the one point Alex made that I thought was the best thing is the flippy floppies. Okay, I call them my flippy floppy customers. Well, I tried this for 4 days and one, right? 6 to 8 weeks program. Like, pick a program, go through it, make sure you're comfortable with it, have your nutrition person come on farm and figure it out, speak to your veterinarian about it, is it the right program, and give it 6 to 8 weeks before you make any decisions. Okay? Weighing your horse, tip weighing, not super accurate, better than nothing, but more important is body condition score. Okay, so it should be across the ribs. The only place on a horse that doesn't have muscle is across the ribs, right? So that's the one place you can look, and that's fat. Everybody's opinion is different, what that should be, okay? In my happy world, if 0 is emaciated and 10 is obese, my pleasure horse is around a 7. Mark Andre would probably argue and say, no way, it's got to be 6, because he's in the racehorse school. So he tells me my horses are too fat. But, you know, when you start getting 8, 9, yeah, they're too fat. They're too fat. That's just a little information chart, and I just want to bring this to your attention. The green is the hay. So you can see on the left side of the screen, your crude protein, your digestible energy, calcium and phosphorus. That big green one there, K, is potassium. One of your biggest sources of potassium is your hay. So people need to understand that. But you can see on to the right of the screen, when you get into some of your macro or your micronutrients, where it doesn't pull it into the diet. And that's why you have to ration balance. If you expect that horse to eat and give you everything it needs to give you to sustain and be healthy, you have to balance its ration. The other big thing I want to point out is Na. Na is sodium. Biggest mistake I see people make, because this directly affects water, which directly affects the digestive system, is not making sure there's enough salt in the diet. For all those people out there, if you want a salt block, knock yourself out, but we're designed originally for ruminants. Okay, ruminants have rough tongues. They can in there and they can really get after it and pull some salt off it. Horses have softer tongues. Unless they're chomping at it, they're probably not getting enough. And because we have a lot of crossbreeds out there, we're not going to feed them a lot of grain. So they're not even pulling a lot of sodium from their grain. So I feed all my horses 1,000 pounds and above, 50 grams of white salt every single day. every day, right in their diet. They have blocks out in their field, but I put it right in their feed every day. So you don't need happy special salt, you don't need sea salt, you don't need iodized salt. I'm talking sodium chloride, white salt. So my last questions, again, how much does your horse drink? How much hay does he or she ingest by weight? Nobody in North America here weighs their hay. In Europe, they do, because they're short on forages. They have to be careful that the horse gets enough to maintain gut health, but enough to last the season. What is in your hay, you don't know unless you do a hay test. If you're boarding somewhere and that's not possible, then work with your local rep. They can usually figure out, and we at Purina take geographical averages. We data bank that for all our species. So I can even go into my ruminant colleague stuff and pull out the hay test and convert it to horse terms. So we can figure that out pretty quick. And then the last thing is, do you see your horse in the mission statement of your feed tag? Right? If you have a miniature and you're feeding Trimax, I hope you're only feeding like about 30 grams because you may blow them up otherwise. But do you see the horse in the mission statement? Anyway, thank you to the Sharpe girls, who I've loved working with in the past, and for having me to fill in today. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to catch me later. Thank you.